Hi, my name is Timmy, and this is Tim Jong-un Productions. So believe it or not, and this is something that not even my closest friends and family know, but I like anime. Despite never having talked about this topic ever in my entire life, anime is a medium that I absolutely love and respect. Naturally, like any other art form, there are a handful of artists and voices that I consider my favorites, one of them being Science Saru. Not only was the studio co-created by one of my favorite anime directors, but is also responsible for some of the most inventive and creative anime films and shows within the past 2 decades. Therefore, when it was announced that Science Saru would be producing, animating, and directing a Scott Pilgrim anime, I was hyped, not just because the source material was perfect for a Science Saru anime, but it would also feature the return of the entire main cast of the 2010 live-action adaptation of the comic books, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, directed by one of my favorite directors working today, Edgar Wright. While it is by no means my favorite film from him, that honor goes to The World's End, it is still a movie that I love and have watched dozens of times. You see, even though I've never read the Scott Pilgrim comics and wasn't all too familiar with the source material, I could still tell just how anime-y this narrative felt. Not only does the film's story, structure, and characters feel somewhat reminiscent of battle action shonen manga, but there were a lot of visuals and gags that felt reminiscent of anime as well. In many ways, this is sort of the best live-action anime adaptation that I never thought I'd get or wanted, so when it was announced that a Scott Pilgrim anime was being made, I thought this was a natural next step. Anyway, after binge watching the entire series and then rewatching Wright's movie afterwards, all within the span of like 3 days, I have come to a conclusion that I'm pretty sure will be a controversial, unpopular thing to say, but I believe that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is an improvement on Scott Pilgrim vs. the World in almost every conceivable way. Now, before some of you immediately hit the dislike button and scream in the comments how wrong I am, let me first explain myself. You see, even though I was really excited for the Scott Pilgrim anime, I also wasn't sure what I was supposed to expect. You see, when the anime was being marketed, it primarily focused on things like the cast from the movie returning, or the visuals, or how a lot of the iconic characters were being brought back. There was very little information about the actual story, so I just assumed this was going to be a remake of the film that would be more faithful to the comics, and at first it kind of feels like that's where the direction is going. In the very first episode, aside from like a handful of minor differences, it is mostly a beat-for-beat recreation of the first 20 to 30 minutes of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Boy plays in a band, boy dates a high schooler, boy has dream about girl, boy tells gay roommate about said girl, boy awkwardly references pop culture to girl, boy orders bullshit off the internet to meet girl again, girl goes out with boy, boy and girl kiss, girl visits boy's band concert, and boy fights Indian wizard. I was a bit disappointed at first that I was more or less watching shit I've already seen, but then out of nowhere, the anime plays its first trap card by having Scott not only lose his fight against Matthew Patel, but also supposedly lose so hard that he's been obliterated to pocket change. This not only completely caught me off guard, but it also got me super hyped for what's to come throughout the rest of the series. Even though I was 100% unconvinced that Scott was dead, I mean, come on, the show is called Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. The fact that this anime was making such a drastic departure meant that there were now new stakes with new storylines that were ripe with potential. From the very first episode, the show takes a very big swing, and in my opinion, it's a swing that pays off. Now, there are all sorts of things that I could talk about in this anime that I personally like more than in Wright's film. For example, I could talk about how the action scenes in this anime are way more creative, expressive, and visually striking to look at than in the movie, and that's not to say the fight scenes in the movie were bad or anything, far from it, but the fights in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off just goes on a whole other level. I mean, the action scenes in episodes 2 through 4 alone are just drop-dead gorgeous to watch. Additionally, I could talk about how the anime leans harder into the wacky and absurd tone of its premise more than the live-action film did, while also having the more serious and emotional moments. I could dedicate an entire video essay about each of these topics, but the one that I want to primarily focus on, that I believe to be the #1 biggest improvement on Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, is the characters, specifically the characters who aren't Scott Pilgrim. Now, there are some people who have criticized this show for pulling a Kevin Smith He-Man bait and switch in which Scott Pilgrim doesn't appear in his own show, and while I can't speak to the former because I haven't seen it, I think in this case the bait and switch actually works effectively well. When it is revealed that Scott isn't actually dead but was secretly kidnapped and his death was fake, it not only creates an overall conflict that helps drive the story and characters, but it also gives all the non-Scott characters a chance to develop into fully fleshed out characters instead of just either being plot devices or background noise like they were in the movie. The character that especially gets the most development is Ramona, who more or less becomes the main character of the anime, and in my opinion, this is an incredibly smart decision. Unlike in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, where she's basically a prize for Scott to win after kicking Jason Schwartzman's ass wrapped up as a manic pixie dream girl, here she actually gets to grow and develop on her own independently from Scott. By focusing the attention on Ramona, we get to learn more about her as a character other than the fact that she has 7 evil exes and she constantly dyes her hair. We learn more about her past, her future, her insecurities and fears, but most importantly, we see an actual arc from Ramona, something that was completely lacking in Wright's film. In a way, she kind of goes through a similar journey that Scott did in Versus the World, in which she concludes that, regardless of whether it was her intention, she's kind of a bad person who is always pushing people away and making them feel like shit. And this is a perfect transition to the other point that I wanted to mention that I think is also an improvement on the movie, is how the 7 evil exes are portrayed. Unlike in Wright's film, in which the 7 evil exes are basically over-the-top video game villain of the week bosses that Scott has to explode into coins so that he can have the right to pork Ramona, in the anime they're real characters with actual depth and humanity. They become evil and conspire against Scott and Ramona not because they're mustache-twirling villains, but because they have their own inner conflicts that they have to overcome. One of the best examples of this is in arguably the best episode of the entire anime, episode 3. In this section, Ramona is attacked by Roxy Richer while she's out looking for Scott, and not only does this lead to arguably one of the sickest fights in the entire anime, in which the location is constantly changing between different movie genres and settings, but also provides a deep dive into why Roxy became evil in the first place. She's mad at Ramona for basically abandoning her in college. She left without saying goodbye or leaving any kind of closure, and this betrayal traumatized Roxy, and Ramona recognizes she fucked up, and while she can't do anything to change the past, she can at least try to rectify her mistakes by owning up to them now and do right by Roxy for once. It's a really well communicated and thematically rich episode, and not once does this depth get in the way of the flashy visuals or the exhilarating action. It complements them. There is so much subtext and layers littered throughout this fight, and this is just in episode 3. There's plenty of this sort of stuff scattered throughout the rest of the series, as like I mentioned, pretty much all the 7 evil exes get their moment to shine. Matthew Patel goes from being a random side villain that gets murked in the first 30 minutes of the movie into a fleshed out character who is so frustrated by the fact that he basically got nothing out of beating quote-unquote Scott that it drives him to challenge Gideon and take over his entire empire after beating him in this epic fight. Speaking of which, while in the film Gideon is just purely an emotionally abusive asshole and the final evil ex that Scott has to defeat, in the anime it's revealed that Gideon isn't evil for the sake of being evil. He's compensating for the fact that he was a total loser in high school and is trying to reinvent himself as this media empire mogul. He's so ashamed of his past that he literally changes his name from Gordon Goose to Gideon Graves. Even the evil exes that remain pretty consistent with their movie counterparts like Lucas Lee and Todd Ingram are expanded upon by having them engage in pretty humorous and entertaining scenarios, like Todd cheating on Envy and hooking up with Wallace, and Lucas fighting a bunch of paparazzi ninjas and becoming BFFs with the adult formerly known as Gideon Graves when they're both down on their luck and have to crash at Julie's house. The Kadiyanagi twins, actually they don't really get much expansion, though they do talk this time and get a cool-ass robot, so that's something. But it's not just the evil exes. A lot of the side characters like young Neil and Julie get some things to do as well, which help them create more fun and memorable roles in the overall story. However, if there's one side character that really benefited from this anime, it's Knives, as she feels like a real character this time with her own desires and independence. One of my issues with Knives in Versus the World is that her entire identity is completely tied to Scott and his actions, and she doesn't really become her own character until she decides to finally let Scott go and reconciles that he loves Ramona and not her. To me, this always felt cheap because not only does she not make this decision until the literal last minute of the film, but her decision to even do all this stuff just feels abrupt and unearned, and she would have really benefited from more time to become her own person instead of having like 99% of her screen time either obsessing over Scott or plotting her revenge against Ramona. While I recognize that's kind of the point of her role in the film, it still kind of leaves her a somewhat weak and one-dimensional character. But in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, she actually has a sense of agency and overall has shit to do in the story. While she starts out as the star and love-struck high schooler who was obsessed with Scott and his band, Scott's death forced her to move away from that and find her own identity, and she does. She learns to play bass and eventually keys, and she's so good at it that she not only becomes a member of Sex Bomb, but also helps get the musical about Scott's life produced. Therefore, when Scott is brought back, reunites with Knives, and Knives tells him that she's moved on, it actually feels earned because we saw how much this girl has grown, even if she is never the main focus of attention. But speaking of Scott, and don't worry I didn't forget about him, I found his journey and character arc really fascinating. So as I mentioned before, Scott had his death faked and was kidnapped because he was thrown into a portal that took him into the future, in which he meets old Scott, who's trying to prevent present Scott from falling in love with Ramona, because doing so eventually led to their separation and left old Scott with a broken heart and nothing to show for. When old Scott's plans fail, he becomes even more insane and transforms into this jacked fighter god who is so afraid of and angry with Ramona breaking his heart that he literally tries to beat the shit out of young Scott and Ramona. What I found so interesting about this conflict and Scott's arc in general is that in many ways they run parallel with the journey that Scott had to go through in Versus the World. Both Scotts in these mediums realize that they're kind of shitty people and they need to take responsibility for themselves if they want to outgrow their toxic selves and become not just better boyfriends but better guys in general. But where movie Scott Scott learns his lesson by fighting 7 evil exes, anime Scott learns this by fighting himself, and in a way, the latter is kind of more satisfying. In the anime, he's not only trying to prove to others that he loves Ramona, but to himself that he loves her as well. And even if their relationship doesn't end up panning out, it's better to have loved and lost than to never have loved. And you could argue that Ramona also learns a similar lesson. Even though she only went on like one date with Scott, she is still desperate to find him because she knows that in her heart, she has that spark with Scott. And while she also doesn't know if the relationship will crash and burn, that spark still makes love worth searching and fighting for. Future Ramona loved old Scott even after all their rough patches, and while she doesn't love him anymore because of what he has become, she still encourages present Ramona to go for it and kiss Scott because she too understands that if there's even a remote chance of love and happiness, then it is absolutely 100% worth fighting for. This is an incredibly powerful and clever way of exploring Scott and Ramona's relationship, and it can still keep that sense of style, visual flair, and creatively kinetic action scenes that Wright's movie had. However, despite how much I love this show, I also recognize that it's not perfect, as it does have some flaws. For starters, one advantage that I think Versus the World has over Takes Off is that because the former is a film, it's able to structure its narrative in a way that allows it to become much better paced than the anime series. Additionally, while I'm happy that the original cast of the movie returned to voice their characters, that doesn't necessarily make them great voice actors. While some of the actors like Mae Whitman as Roxy and Chris Evans as Lucas Lee do a great job playing their characters, others were just kind of Like Mary Elizabeth Winstead, for example, isn't a bad voice actor by any means, but there were more than a couple of times where she was sounding very monotone and it didn't really mesh well with the over-the-top spunk anime-y tone of the show, if that makes sense. I felt this way about a lot of the other voice actors like Michael Cera, Brandon Routh, Anna Kendrick, and Brie Larson as well, not just Winstead, but whatever, that's just me. And if it ever became such a big problem, I just switched to the Japanese version, so no harm, no foul. I also felt like some other characters like Kim, Envy, and Wallace could have gotten more development as they could have done more, but again, whatever. Maybe they'll get that in a potential season 2, though apparently a season 2 isn't even in the cards right now. But anyway, despite me arguing why I think this anime is an improvement upon the movie, I don't want to make it sound like the anime is a replacement for the film. Far from it. The anime isn't a sequel to the movie per se, it's more of a reinterpretation. As noted Old Boy director Spike Lee said one time, the anime heavily references Wright's film to the point that when the characters attempt to make a movie and then later a musical about Scott in an alternate reality in which he actually beat Matthew Patel, it very much mirrors the storyline of Versus the World. You can also interpret old Scott and Ramona as the Scott and Ramona from Versus the World and what happened to them after the events of the movie, so I guess in that sense it's also an alternate reality sequel, as Wright said. Either way, it allows the anime to have plenty of clever nudge nudge wink wink moments while also expanding upon what Wright had built in his movie. It's best to think of both the film and anime like spaghetti and meatballs, two awesome things that complement each other perfectly well. Anyway, that's all I pretty much have to say about this. It's funny, this video wasn't even intended to be this long, but I guess I never realized just how much I truly loved this anime until I started writing the script. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. I love it, and I honestly kind of want to watch it again. I'm very interested in hearing what you guys think about the show, so comment below what you guys thought about the anime, and if you still want to comment why I'm wrong or why I'm stupid, then I guess I can't stop you either. Thanks for listening to my TED Talk, and I'll see you all in the next video.